I'm Jim Bennett. I'm a Senior Regional Cloud Advocate at Microsoft, and I'm here to guide you through the process of getting signed up for GitHub and installing all the tools that we will need for this 2-day event. The whole purpose of this event is to learn about Git, about GitHub, and how to contribute to open source. And before you can do that, you need to get signed up with GitHub and get a few tools installed. So what are we going to go through in this session? Well, to actually complete this event, you will need 3 things. So the first thing you need is you will need a GitHub account. So we'll walk you through getting signed up with GitHub. Next, we need to install a piece of software called GitHub Desktop. This is a tool that allows you to interact with GitHub locally. So you can download your code, just commit your code back up to GitHub, and generally just do all the things you need to do locally on your laptop. And then finally, we're going to install Visual Studio Code, which is a developer text editor, and is the tool you'll be using to work on code throughout this 2-day event. Now, there are other tools you can use. You can use the Git command line instead of GitHub Desktop. You can use other IDEs. So if you've got experience in other tools, feel free to use them. But for this event, we'll be focusing on GitHub Desktop and VS Code as the tools you use to interact with GitHub. If you use other tools, then you might be on your own. Our mentors may not be able to help you. So if you know what you're doing, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, stick to the tools we recommend. So let's start with GitHub. Let's start with actually getting you set up with GitHub. Now, when developers build software, it's really good practice to use a version control system. So this is a tool where developers can store and share code, tracking the different versions of each code file. And these can be run privately or in the cloud. Some enterprises will run a version control system locally. Other places will run these in the cloud. Now, GitHub is an online code repository running in the cloud. And it's where millions of developers store and share their code and where they collaborate to build software. And this is a version control system you can use for your projects, whether they're personal projects or work projects. It is an online version control system you can use. Now, the code in GitHub is stored in repositories, which is often shortened to repos. And these are code stores that one or more developers have access to. And they store a full version history of the code changes made over time. So you write code, it stores that. You make changes, it tracks those changes. You make more changes, it tracks those changes. Someone else makes changes, it tracks those. So it keeps the complete history over time of the code changes that are made to your source code. Now, GitHub is probably the biggest online code repository, incredibly popular with open source projects. And so open source is code that is built in the open with communities of people coming together to define the project and build the software, and it's hosted on GitHub. So what is GitHub? Let's dive a bit more into what is GitHub, and let's actually do that through this video from GitHub themselves.
What do you mean, what is GitHub? It's the largest, most complete development platform in the world. Millions of developers use it. And it's not just developers. These days, every company is a software company. I thought you might say that. Come on, let me show you. GitHub is an enterprise transforming, startup launching, community driven, super secure, open source championing, cloud-based platform. It's where the world builds software.
We created algorithms
and global businesses.
We even went to Mars.
Or at least our code did.
Oh, yes. With GitHub, anything is possible. But how? Say this is Sanal, a senior software engineer, and this is a team's project on GitHub. Sanal and her team can create their own branches of code to work together in parallel.
This is my branch, an alternate timeline where I can build, squash bugs, and safely experiment. There are communication and task delegation tools right next to my code. So when we're ready to merge, we merge instantly.
It works with thousands of branches for over 1 million projects.
And with built-in project planning, automation, CI/CD, and AI-enhanced code editing at every step.
You can move fast and get your ducks in a row! But we gotta be safe about it.
GitHub has advanced security with automatic vulnerability detection, secret scanning, and more. So we can build and ship safely and securely.
So, now you know what GitHub is, you might wonder who GitHub is. It's a student learning to code. It's disruptors revolutionizing music. It's a CEO transforming a global company. It's 21,000 strangers working together to take the first picture of a black hole. It's a place for anyone from anywhere to build anything. Anything you think the world needs. What's that? You already knew that? Well, why didn't you say anything? I was talking for ages back there. It's embarrassing.
So now we've learned a bit more about GitHub, let's actually get signed up. You'll need to have a GitHub account before you can get started with the activities of this event. So to work with the stuff we're doing over this event and to work with the majority of open source projects, you will need a GitHub account. So what we'll do, the next few steps will get you signed up with GitHub. Now, signing up is free. So for everything you need to do for this event and to contribute to open source will not cost you anything. You won't need a credit card to sign up. It is completely free. And the majority of what you do on GitHub is free. There are paid tiers, which are usually designed for companies, enterprise customers, or folks who do a lot of their own development and need access to more features. But for everything you're doing will be completely free. So you start by heading to github.com/signup. Now, if you've already got a GitHub account, if you've already signed up, then yeah, just relax the next few minutes. But obviously, please be conscious of the folks who haven't signed up. So we're here to help everyone get signed up. So github.com/signup is where you get started. And there's mentors in the room who are here to help. So from the sign up, the first thing you need to do is enter your email. Like all cloud services, you need an email so they can identify you, contact you, and you can sign in. So step 1, enter your email. Step 2, password. Now, security first, ideally use a password manager. GitHub also supports multi-factor authentication through YubiKeys, SMS, GitHub application, Microsoft Authenticator, Google Auth, whatever tool you want. Highly recommend you use multi-factor authentication. In fact, a lot of enterprises insist on this. So if you have a GitHub account that you use for work and you use it for home use, you still have to have multi-factor authentication set up. That can be configured by your organization. So come up with a password. If ideally you want to use a password manager for this. So don't just use the same password you've used in everything else. Use a password manager. If you don't have one installed, get one installed now and then use a password manager to manage your password. Right, final step is your username. So this is like your social media handle that you might use on Twitter or YouTube. This is used to create your account. Your account will exist at github.com/whatever is your username. So choose wisely. If you've got a social handle that you use on other platforms, it's kind of a good idea to use that. For example, I use Jim Bob Bennett on all my platforms. So I have github.com/JimBobBennett, youtube.com/@JimBobBennett, twitter.com/JimBobBennett. It kind of gives me that online identity that I can use everywhere. So if you have a social handle you use that here, but choose wisely if you don't. If you come up with something new, make sure it's something that's easy for you to remember, but something that you're happy with as well. Now you can change your username later if you want to. However, when things like issues and pull requests tag you, we'll cover issues and pull requests later on, but you can be tagged in these and they'll put at your name. If you change your username, any references to you will no longer point to you. Also, if you change your username, if anyone goes to github.com/your old username, they will get redirected to your new username until someone else takes that name. So you could end up, if you change your name, having other people being pointed to instead of you. So it's kind of a good idea not to change unless you really need to. So think wisely about what is a good username. Right, once that's done, you need to verify that you're human. And rather than those boring captures where you're trying to work out whether it's a zebra crossing or spot bicycles, instead you are tested on your knowledge of space, and you have to pick the spiral galaxy. Now, if you don't know what a spiral galaxy is, it is a galaxy that is shaped like a spiral with multiple arms spiraling in the middle. And on here, for the Spiral Galaxy is the top middle picture. It's kind of a bit more fun than the boring captures, but yes, if your knowledge of space is not great, this could be a bit tricky. Cool. Once you're done, they just need to verify who you are. So they would have sent a verification code to your email. Enter that code here to complete the setup. Now, don't forget to check your spam folders. You know, these emails could go there, but you need to get that code in to verify your email. And that's it. You are now signed up with GitHub. This is what you'll be seeing now, something like this, where you've got getting started, links to tools you can download, a few hints and tips there, but you are now signed up. You are ready to commit code to contribute to open source projects or your own code. Now, once you're signed in, it's kind of good to configure your GitHub profile. As this profile allows you to share information about yourself, such as an avatar, location, Twitter handle, description, and other information. So it's kind of your place to personalize a little bit. Let people know about you. Obviously, you could share as much information as you want, or as little if you don't want to share too much information. But this can help, especially if you're looking for work and you want people to know more about you. Your GitHub profile can be kind of a good place to start. It's good to share your interests, things like that. Again, if you're using this to get work, or you want to use this as kind of that social connection. So to do this, click on your image in the top corner, so your avatar in the top corner, and then select settings. This is where you can access all the settings for your GitHub repo or your whole GitHub account. And then from there, select public profile and do the configuration that you want. From the profile as well, there's also an appearance section where you can configure things like dark mode if you want to go from bright white to dark mode. So here's my public profile. So you'll see on one side of the screen, clicked on my face, menu drop down, shows settings. Then under settings, under public profile, I can put my name, I can put an email address if I want to share that, I can put a short biography about myself, a link to my website, my Twitter username, the company I work for, and all that kind of information on here. And then as mentioned, next 2 steps down on the menu, appearance, this is where you can configure things like light mode and dark mode. So once you've got your profile configured, you're ready to go. Now, a quick note to any students in the audience. If you're a student, you should sign up for what's called GitHub Global Campus at education.github.com/students. Now, you'll need an academic email address for this to verify that you're a student, or access to student ID. You can upload the student ID to help get yourself verified. If you upload student ID, it can take a while to be verified rather than immediate if you're using an academic email address. But what you get when you join the Global Campus is you get access to this GitHub Student Developer Pack. And that unlocks a whole lot of offers that you can use with your GitHub account for various tools and services and developer tools. You get free licenses of some developer tools, access to cloud services, things like that. Also, if you're a community-minded person, maybe the kind of person who wants to run an event like this, you can sign up to become a GitHub Campus expert. These are community folks on campuses who help fellow students get up to speed with GitHub and learn about GitHub. They've also got access to paid internships and mentorship opportunities. So if you're interested in internship or getting mentorship, they can apply through there. It's kind of a good community to do to get access to those opportunities ahead of other people. Now, this is not necessary to complete this event. So any students here, don't worry too much about signing up now. This is something you can do during the breaks or after the event to sign up for the GitHub Global Campus. But as a student, highly recommend you do this because you get a lot of good freebies. So we've got GitHub account set up. Now we need to interact with our GitHub account. This exists in the cloud. We're not going to do all our work in the cloud. We're going to need to take code from the cloud, bring that to our local machines to use, to develop, and to write code. And GitHub Desktop is a desktop application that allows you to interact with GitHub. Now, under the hood of GitHub, there is a source control system called Git. And Git was originally written in 2005, so almost 20 years ago, by Linus Torvalds, the person behind Linux. In fact, it was actually created to track the development of Linux. There wasn't a good enough source control system available at the time, in Linus's view, therefore he invented Git. Now, Git is fundamentally a command line tool. So you set up a Git server using the command line, you interact it with the command line. But it's much easier, especially for beginners, to work with the user interface, rather than having to remember all the different Git commands. The Git commands can be confusing. It is an incredibly powerful tool, and obviously with great power comes a lot of confusing commands. And so to make things a bit easier to get going, a good UI tool like GitHub Desktop is absolutely invaluable. So GitHub Desktop sits on top of Git and does all the interaction that you need Git to do, but through a UI to make things easier. So what you need to do is go to desktop.github.com and then download the relevant version for your computer. Now, if you are using Linux, so anyone in the room using Linux, unfortunately there isn't a version of GitHub Desktop available to you. So for that, you're going to need to use the Git command line, or when you install VS Code later, you can use that to interact with Git. We have mentors in the room who can help you with this if necessary. But yes, if you have Linux, you can't use GitHub Desktop. Though I'm assuming if you're running Linux, you're probably a slightly more advanced user. Therefore, using things like Git shouldn't be too difficult for you. But if you need any help, mentors are here to help. So once you've installed GitHub Desktop, launch it, and then you sign in with your GitHub account. So you click the sign into github.com button. That will then take you to your browser to sign in with GitHub. And that gets you signed in and connected. And once you're signed in, GitHub Desktop will have access to your GitHub account. You can clone your repositories, you can push code, it'll be authenticated for you. Now, as part of the setup process, you have to configure Git. So whenever you commit code, so whenever you make a change and send that change to GitHub, and we'll cover commits later on in this event, whenever you commit code, you have to say who you are. So you have to have some form of identifier for you. And so what you would do is you would configure your code to either use your GitHub account on email address, or you can configure it manually using different settings. I would just recommend using your GitHub account and email address. And that way, every time you commit code, it is linked to your GitHub account. So if I were to commit code to someone else's repository, they would be able to see that it was me and follow a link back to my GitHub profile to learn more about me. This is kind of important because when you commit code, people need to know who you are. Nobody in an open source project is going to accept code from some anonymous user. That's kind of a big red flag. So you want to make sure that it links back to you. Now, when you use Git, you do have to put an email address there. GitHub allows you to use a proxy email address. That's a fake one if you want to hide your email address, but you do need to have an email address so people can actually find you. Because the idea behind this, it's a distributed version control system. People work asynchronously on code, and if there's a question about the code, then you better contact you. Now, if you set up to use the defaults, that will pick the default email address used when you signed up with GitHub. You can add more email addresses on GitHub. So if you've got like a relay email address or a fake email address you like to use, set that up on GitHub, and you better choose that in this configuration tab. And that's it. GitHub Desktop is now ready to go. We'll be using this a lot more in the second part of this day's activities when we actually start cloning code and contributing to a repository. Now, the last tool we want to install is Visual Studio Code. Now, Visual Studio Code is the world's most popular developer text editor. It is majority open source. And in fact, you can actually build and run or just download VS Codium, which is a fully open source version. Now, the official Microsoft Visual Studio Code release contains a small amount of non-open source code. And this refers to things like icons, trademarks, which obviously copyright Microsoft, and they have some proprietary feature monitoring code in there, just to kind of get an idea of how much the application is being used and allow development teams to understand how VS Code is being used, track issues, catch crashes if they happen, catch bugs, and just be aware of what's going on. Now, telemetry like this is fairly standard in any application, whether it's phone apps that you use, desktop apps. A lot of developers will track this information because they want to make sure that features are being used, and they want to look at the patterns developers or users use through the application to understand the application flow, and they can use that to optimize the code. So it's fairly standard tracking, so that monitoring and the copyright is not open source. But otherwise, the majority of VS Code is fully open source, and you can even make contributions to this project if you want to. Now, VS Code is a developer text editor in that it's designed just to work on text, but it has a whole powerful extension model. And using different extensions, you can bring in capability to work with a huge range of programming languages, cloud services, and other tools. For example, if you want to code in Python, you can bring in extensions to give you IntelliSense that kind of auto-complete your Python code for you and kind of understand your code and debug it. It's kind of a whole lot of different tools you can add into VS Code to give you different capabilities. And later in this event, we'll install a few extensions to kind of help us with the work that we're doing. Now install VS Code from code.visualstudio.com. And from there, you can download for Mac, Windows, or Linux, and then run the relevant installer as needed. Now, on some variants of Linux, you can actually install this from the command line with sudo apt update and sudo apt install code. So just install it straight from the apt repository. Now, if you install this on Windows, there will be some options to add open with code to files and folders. It is really helpful to actually check those options as part of the installer. That way you can go into any folder or any file in Explorer, right click and open with code. It's kind of a really good quick shortcut. So I highly recommend you do that on Windows. And that's it. We are done. You are all set up. You have your GitHub account sorted, and you have GitHub Desktop installed and VS Code installed. So you're all ready for this event.